Good morning, I'm Joe Fryer.
And I'm Stephen Romo in for Savannah Sellers today. And right now on Morning News Now, scrutiny and setbacks, mounting problems for Donald Trump on the state and federal levels. This morning, the former president facing a lawsuit filed by New York's Attorney General alleging widespread financial fraud by Trump and his family.
Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal.
Plus, developing overnight, the new ruling against Trump's legal team concerning those documents seized from his MarALago home. We have team coverage this morning. War of words on the world stage. President Biden taking aim at Russian President Vladimir Putin in front of the UN's General Assembly after Russia threatens nuclear retaliation in Ukraine. We'll bring you the latest as the war intensifies. Third time's a charm? That's the hope of the Federal Reserve as it raises interest rates once again. More on the decision meant to bring down record inflation, plus how this could impact you and why more rate hikes could be on the way. And a symbol of pride. As we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month, we explore the evolution of using accent marks in Latino names, why so many immigrants abandoned the accent when they arrived in America, and how they're working to reconnect with their culture by bringing it back. A lot going on this busy Thursday.
Yes, yesterday was busy. We're going to continue the coverage this morning.
A lot. I almost said Friday, so not quite there yet.
You can't will it into being quite yet, yeah.
Almost there. A lot to get to this morning. And we begin this morning with those legal battles. Former President Trump is fighting on multiple fronts.
First, the developments at the federal level. Last night, a U.S. appeals court allowed the Justice Department to resume its review of the documents that it took from Trump's MarALago estate last month. Now, the DOJ was appealing a ruling made by another federal judge, a Trump appointee, who had temporarily barred the DOJ from reviewing those documents as part of its criminal investigation into the former president. Meanwhile, in New York, we're covering the fallout this morning after the state's Attorney General, Letitia James, filed a civil lawsuit against Trump, his family, and the Trump Organization, alleging more than 200 instances of fraud. We've got team coverage ahead for you this morning. We're going to start with NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, who's outside Trump Tower in New York, and NBC News legal analyst Danny Ceballos, who joins us here on set. Vaughn, let's start with you. The New York Attorney General's lawsuit, some very serious allegations here. Walk us through it, and also how Trump and his team are responding.
Over the course of a 220-page lawsuit, you guys, the New York Attorney General lays out the 3.5-year investigation that her office took part in to lead here to this moment. The next step would be to go to the state court, and it's the financial penalties and other corporate penalties that could be the biggest impact for Donald Trump, his 3 children, and his family. Over the course of the lawsuit, she alleges that in more than 200 instances that he and the company inflated the value of their properties and their assets. Just take the Trump property, the Trump Tower property, where he lived here in New York, for example. Saying and contending, alleging that he actually made the apartment on paper 3 times larger than it is in reality, therefore inflating the cost by potentially as much as 3-fold. This is a situation where you see in the report, Letitia James write, with the help of his children and senior executives of the Trump Organization, Donald Trump falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself and cheat the system. And throughout the course of the lawsuit, you see the outlining of the falsification of business records, issuing of false financial statements, the ways in which he allegedly engaged in insurance fraud, in multiple cases laid out of ways in which he conspired with these other individuals to commit these violations. But again, it's the potential penalties, not only a $250 million fine that could be laid down, but it would also permanently bar Donald Trump and his children from ever being officers of any corporation in New York City, which could put into question the future fate of the Trump Organization.
Many potential consequences there, and that's not all. Danny, the Attorney General said that she would send a criminal referral to the IRS and to federal prosecutors based on this lawsuit. So what else could Trump be facing?
It is essentially a dare to the federal government, to the IRS and the Justice Department. Here's all the work we've done. You should probably take a look at this. The question is not so much whether or not they will open an investigation. They surely will. Maybe they already have. But whether or not they will ultimately indict is a very different question. Letitia James's complaint and her civil action requires only proof of a preponderance of the evidence, which is 51%, a far cry from the beyond a reasonable doubt standard used in criminal cases. DOJ knows that. The IRS knows that. They're going to consider that beyond just whether or not there is some damning evidence in this complaint. They need to think about whether or not, if they dare to indict Donald Trump, which no one has tried before, can they prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt?
All right, let's turn to the MarALago investigation. And Vaughn, the federal appeals court now allowing the DOJ to look at the documents that were seized at the estate. What does this mean for that investigation into Trump?
Yeah, this was significant because there was going to be a potential delay of weeks, if not months here, in which the Department of Justice investigators were going to be able to look at particularly the more than 100 documents seized from MarALago that were marked classified. The judge in Cannon, Judge Cannon in Florida, had essentially put a hold on this process and left it up to the special master to comb through these documents and determine whether the Department of Justice investigators are going to be able to look at the contents of these documents that were seized. What happened ultimately was an appeal by the Department of Justice to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals in Atlanta. And that was what that new issue last night was from the Circuit Court of Appeals. There were about 11,000 documents in whole that were seized from MarALago. So about 10,900 of them are still going to have to go through the special master, who will determine whether there is executive privilege, client attorney privilege, or issues over classification. But those really, what the Department of Justice believes to be the most important 100 documents, those that had classified markings on them, the DOJ is going to be able to move forward with its investigation, looking into those particular documents while the special master looks through those other thousands of other documents that were not classified in the same way.
And Trump was actually on Fox News last night talking about those documents that were seized at MarALago. Let's take a listen.
You had said on Truth Social a number of times you did declassify.
I did declassify, yes.
Okay. Is there a process? What was your process to declassify?
There doesn't have to be a process, as I understand it. You know, there's different people say different things, but as I understand, there doesn't have to be. If you're the president of the United States, you can declassify just by saying it's declassified, even by thinking about it, because you're sending it to MarALago or to wherever you're sending it. And there doesn't have to be a process.
Plenty of disagreement on that. So how do you think the DOJ might interpret that claim?
I'm aware of zero instances where the executive can create some action by just thinking about it. If he doesn't tell anyone, doesn't tweet about it, doesn't write it down in a memo, there is no such thing as executive action by thought alone. You got to do a little more than that.
All right. And bottom line is they haven't made that argument yet in court, right?
Oh, there's that too. Yes. There's the fact that his attorneys will not make that same argument in court, even though he's on record saying, I did declassify them apparently by thinking about it. But his attorneys have only gone so far to say as, well, he hypothetically has that power to do so.
Yet again, in multiple courts, the actual court and the court of public opinion. All right. Danny Ceballos, Vaughn Hilliard, thank you both so much.
Let's continue our coverage with NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Rafa, who joins us now. Ali, good morning to you. So we've got a new Morning Consult poll that shows that Trump's support among the GOP is slipping. The question now, are we seeing his support slipping at all among elected Republicans on Capitol Hill? Are we getting any reaction there to this New York AG's lawsuit?
Yeah, good morning, guys. Well, I asked several Republican lawmakers about this latest development yesterday, and it really seems to have cemented the divisions that we've already seen with previous lawsuits against the former president. You know, you have the regular Trump defenders like Senators Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Lindsey Graham saying yesterday that this lawsuit is a political stunt, saying that no one is going to pay attention to this, calling this just another example of Democrats going after Trump, that it'll have no impact on the midterm elections. I spoke with House GOP Conference Chair Elise Stefanik, who said that this was, quote, Tish James on a deranged anti-Trump mission since she became Attorney general, saying this is just another chapter of a, quote, illegitimate witch hunt. And then you have other Republicans who are saying that this is really taking the focus and attention off of issues that they say matter more to voters, especially ahead of these midterm elections. Senator Mitt Romney telling me yesterday that the more we talk about Trump, the more that it takes the focus off of issues like inflation, crime, the crisis at the border. So no doubt that, even though that some Republicans are running to Trump's defense, there's no doubt that this is definitely not what Republicans want or need to be talking about, especially in these last few weeks ahead of the midterm elections.
And Allie, quickly, I want to turn to yet another investigation, the January 6th investigation. We now know Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, has agreed to be interviewed by the House Select Committee. Talk about the significance of that development and what does the committee hope to learn from her?
Yeah, this was a long time coming. There's been months of back and forth between the January 6th committee and Ginny Thomas. As we know, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, her and her legal team. And we learned late last night that the committee has come to an agreement for Ginny Thomas to come forward before the panel and answer questions. Some of the things that she could shed light on are some of the efforts to overturn the election. The committee says that it has email exchanges between Ginny Thomas and former Trump lawyer John Eastman about efforts to overturn the election. We also know that she was communicating with former White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows in the days before January 6th. And so her lawyer says that this was just her efforts because she was caring about her country, that it has nothing to do with efforts to engage on January 6th. We know she wasn't physically present at the Capitol that day, but this is something that the committee has been very interested in learning more about. We know that they plan to have at least one more hearing that's set for next week. It's still to be determined whether, she comes forward before then and whether the information she could share could possibly impact those that next hearing, possibly more hearings.
All right, Allie Raffa, thank you so much.
All right, now to the latest on the war in Ukraine. Speaking before the UN General Assembly yesterday, President Biden sharply criticized Russian President Vladimir Putin after his announcement of a partial military mobilization in Russia after his threats of nuclear retaliation in Kyiv if that doesn't lay down its weapons. President Biden said Russia, quote, shamelessly violated United Nations principles with its invasion of Ukraine. Biden also said he wants the war to end on peaceful terms.
We stood with Ukraine. Like you, the United States wants this war to end on just terms, on terms we all signed up for, that you cannot seize a nation's territory by force, that the only country standing in the way of that is Russia.
NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee joins us now for more on this. And Carol, some stinging words from President Biden yesterday, for sure. Walk us through some of his comments that stood out to you.
Well, what stood out is that the president, from the beginning of his speech, really right out of the gate, he sought to isolate Vladimir Putin on this world stage, and he really called him out as the one man who is responsible for the war in Ukraine, and also saying that he's the only one who still wants to continue this war. Now, the president's speech, obviously, Russian President Vladimir Putin had spoken before the president took to the stage, and so the White House was changing some of what his speech had to say. The theme largely stayed the same in terms of what the message the president wanted to deliver, according to White House officials, but they did tweak it somewhat to address Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons and this plus up in Russian troops that he's planning in Ukraine. Take a listen to President Biden.
President Putin has made overt nuclear threats against Europe and a reckless disregard for the responsibilities of the non-proliferation regime. Now, Russia's calling up more soldiers to join the fight. This world should see these outrageous acts for what they are. Putin claims he had to act because Russia was threatened, but no one threatened Russia.
Now, in terms of the threat of using nuclear weapons from President Putin, what a senior administration official tells us is that there is no evidence yet, nothing tangible that the U.S. is seeing that Putin is backing that rhetoric up with action. So they don't have information that shows this is something that's moving, that would be imminent or is potentially happening sometime soon. But they say that the administration says this is very concerning rhetoric.
Striking to hear an American president target not only one country, but one specific person at the General Assembly like that. And Carol, we're also hearing 2 previously detained U.S. citizens are among those who have been released as part of a major prisoner exchange between Russia and Ukraine. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that's right. So there were 2 Americans who were part of this prisoner exchange that was brokered by the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. Those 2 Americans have been released and are in Saudi custody. They'll go through some medical checks and then will return to the U.S. That's Alex Drueke and Andy Wen. And we're hearing from the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, who issued a statement saying the United States is appreciative of Ukraine, including all prisoners of war, regardless of nationality, in its negotiations. And we look forward to these U.S. citizens being reunited with their families. We're also hearing from the families of the Americans who are being released. The aunt and mother of Alex Drueke issued a statement saying they are thrilled that Andy and Alex will be free, and they look forward to them coming home as well. So a bit of a victory for the U.S. in what has been a large-scale tragedy in Ukraine.
So much relief for those families. All right, Carol, thank you.
For more on the president's speech at the UN and on the Russian war in Ukraine, let's bring in retired Lieutenant General Sept Twitty. He's an NBC News military analyst and former deputy commander of the United States European Command. Lieutenant General, good morning. Good to have you with us. So, I mean, this was a rare chance for the president to speak in front of leaders from all around the globe. In your mind, did he deliver? What's your reaction to his comments on the war?
Yes, I absolutely think he delivered. There's 3 key points that I took away from the speech. Number 1, that Russia violated the core tenets of the UN by encroaching on another country or attacking a sovereign country. Very important that he calls that out. Number 2, Russia's threat to use nukes, obviously totally irresponsible and reckless on President Putin's behalf. And then the third one he talked about is the sham referendums that are supposed to occur in the 4 Oblast on tomorrow. All 3 of those totally irresponsible. So I thought he did a good job calling those out.
Also heard from Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. He addressed the UN General Assembly in a taped video. Let's listen to some of what he said, then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Ukraine wants peace. Europe wants peace. The world wants peace. And we have seen who is the only one who wants war. There is only one entity among all UN member states who would say now, if he could interrupt my speech, that he's happy with this war.
Okay, so Zelensky didn't mention Putin by name there, but he did call on Russia to be punished for the war. So as Putin calls for more troops to fight, as Ukraine appears to continue to pick up momentum, what should be Ukraine's strategy going forward?
Well, that's just it. Ukraine must continue the momentums. They've consolidated their gains. They've had success in at least taking 8,000 kilometers of territory back. So they must continue that. The winter months coming, so they have to figure out how they continue to keep this pressure on. Because at the end of the day, what it's going to be about is taking more territory and ensuring that they have a position of strength if we can ever get to the bargaining table.
We should also note Putin's decision to call out more troops has led to protests on the streets in Moscow and St. Petersburg yesterday. Numerous protesters were detained. Quickly, Lieutenant General, what do these protests tell us about the support within Russia for this war?
Well, I think just as the soldiers on the battlefield, the Russian soldiers on the battlefield, the people as well, they don't understand this war. It's been called a special operation, not war. Now, by calling up folks out of the Russian population to go join this particular special operation, folks are confused. They don't understand. They have soldiers coming back in body bags. So this war has not been properly communicated to the soldiers that are fighting, nor the Russian population.
All right, Lieutenant General Twitty, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate your analysis.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Moving on to your money now. The Federal Reserve raising interest rates again.
Yeah, benchmark interest rates are going up 0.75 of a percentage point, but many economists believe it's not the last.
NBC News business and data reporter Brian Chung is here now. Brian, good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. And this latest hike, though, doesn't really come as a surprise. We know Fed Chair Jerome Powell spoke about it yesterday. What did he have to say?
Yeah, markets expected that to be 0.75 percentage points in that meeting yesterday. That's exactly what happened. So why did markets sell off about 1.7%? It's because of the commentary and the somber outlook, let's put it, that the Fed Chair Jay Powell offered in his press conference yesterday. One big reason, there's a lot of things out of his control. Take a listen.
Part of this inflation is caused by this series of supply shocks that we've had, beginning with the pandemic and really with the reopening of the economy, and more recently amplified and added to by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What we need to do is get rates up to the point where we're putting meaningful downward pressure on inflation, and that's what we're doing.
And getting rates up, what he referred to there implies that there are more rate hikes on the way. One challenge here is that he said he's unsure if these rate hikes in totality will lead to a recession. Again, that's because of things like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. There are a lot of other external factors that could be weighing on the U.S. economic outlook as well.
So what happens if those additional rate hikes in the coming months don't have the impact on people's wallets that they're hoping for? Does the Fed have any other tools here to fight inflation, or is this their main tool?
Well, it's important to note that while a lot of people look to the Federal Reserve to say they need to use their interest rate tools, right, increasing borrowing costs to make it more expensive for households and businesses to borrow, maybe that takes economic pace down a little bit in a way that could take inflation down. They're not the only ones that can do that, though. Fiscal policy, which is translation, Congress, the White House, those types of policymakers can do things as well in a more targeted way. So if you look at the components of inflation that have really taken a leg up and might continue to take a leg up in the future, think about rents, for example, right? A lot of people getting concessions during 2020. There's a reversal of that now for anyone that's tried to sign a new one-year lease. Everyone's aware of that. Also, energy prices. Yes, gasoline has come down. Who's to say if that's going to reverse at any point in time? Those are things that fiscal policymakers in Congress and Washington, D.C. have the ability to address.
I wanted to quickly ask you, we also got a glimpse of the Fed's broader economic forecast. What can you tell us about those projections?
So, again, these are things that come out quarterly. So the Fed chair, in addition to the announcement yesterday, also had some outlook on where unemployment, economic growth, and inflation could go in the future. And we talked about this yesterday a little bit with the Federal Reserve expected to see inflation remaining high through at least the next year or two. But what's really interesting were their projections on unemployment. They're projecting that the unemployment rate could go up as they raise interest rates from 3.7% as of August to 4.4% next year. And even though that doesn't sound like all that much, keep in mind that would be about 1.2 million more Americans than now put out of work. So a very, very serious thing we're talking about here.
Big number.
Yeah, especially with unemployment being such a bright spot in the otherwise grim economy. All right, Brian, thanks so much.
Coming up on Morning News now, Puerto Rico picking up the pieces after Hurricane Fiona. No power or clean water, and now a new threat this morning.
This as the Category 4 storm barrels toward Bermuda. We'll track its path coming up next.
Hurricane Fiona is continuing to tear through the Atlantic Ocean as a Category 4 storm. It's expected to brush by Bermuda before hitting Canada. Yes, Canada later this week. Now, Bermuda is not in Fiona's direct path, but officials there are still urging residents and tourists to prepare for severe weather. The island is bracing for high winds and a storm surge as a result of the hurricane. Fiona has already decimated the Caribbean, leaving Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic without power. NBC News correspondent Morgan Chesky joins us now from Bermuda with the latest. Morgan, good morning to you. So walk us through what you're seeing there this morning. Are you starting to see those high winds, and how are people there preparing for Fiona?
Yeah, Joe, good morning. We are about 24 hours, 18 to 24 hours away from the potential impact, the heavy impact from the arrival of Fiona. And here in Bermuda, the sun breaking through some of the clouds, but we are starting to feel just the beginning of those winds starting to pick up here. As far as preparations go, people we have spoken to on the island very aware that they could be getting a glancing blow from this current Category 4 hurricane that will potentially be a Category 3 when it kind of sideswipes Bermuda before heading north, as you mentioned, to Canada. We're still talking about sustained winds of more than 75 miles an hour here on the island, anywhere from 2 to 4 inches of rain that could cause some localized flooding. And that is why people are going ahead, covering their windows. A lot of businesses already starting to close. We have one of the rescue boats here on the island. We're told that this will be moving to a safer mooring here ahead, as the surf is expected to get incredibly rough. Joe, one of the big concerns here is flooding in this area. This is St. George's community here on the island. We do know that this can flood when storm surge rolls in, but we are told by locals that as bad as Fiona may be, it will be nothing to what they saw 8 years ago. That was when Bermuda was struck by 2 hurricanes within 1 week. That was Faye and Hurricane Gonzalo, causing widespread power outages and flooding to the island. So as of right now, everyone watching and waiting, as this path of Fiona could still veer somewhat in the next 24 hours or so.
We know you'll keep an eye on it. Let's also talk about Puerto Rico. The National Weather Service issued a heat advisory for the island with an expected heat index above 100 degrees. That's got to be compounding what's already a dire situation there, right?
Absolutely. The people in Puerto Rico still don't have a firm timeline on when power will be restored. The shock of Hurricane Maria is still incredibly fresh in everyone's minds there. You couple that with the fact that the weather, this heat, is going to pose such a serious issue going forward, and it's disheartening. We have heard from the governor of Puerto Rico assuring residents that they had a better plan coming into this hurricane with Fiona as it struck the island. But as we see this widespread damage across that entire area, it's of little solace to the people who, as of this moment, are still without power and now face incredibly high temperatures.
All right,
Joe?
Morgan Chesky, stay safe. We'll be checking back with you over the next 24, 48 hours.
All right, let's get a closer check of your weather now.
And meteorologist Michelle Grossman is tracking Fiona and telling us where it's going, including that unusual path northward, right?
That's right, to Canada. And my twin sister has a trip booked. Guess where she's going?
Canada?
Bermuda.
Oh, okay.
Anywhere. They're going on Saturday.
Okay,
she
well,
keeps texting
all right.
me. Canada. All right, let's talk about the latest here, because we are looking at a Category 4 storm. It is a strong storm. We're looking at winds at 130 miles per hour. We're going to see it weaken just a bit, but still really strong as it passes by Bermuda. Right now, the location is 485 miles southwest of Bermuda. It's going to continue to move north, but notice it made that little turn towards the northeast, and that was expected, starting to pick up speed as well, 13 miles per hour. So it'll speed by, and then it's going to slow down once it gets closer to Canada. We do have a hurricane warning for Bermuda because we do expect hurricane force winds there. We expect hurricane force winds in Canada as well, even though it won't be classified as a hurricane by then. So let's look at the impacts here. We expect it to be a Category 3 storm. That was downgraded since the last advisory. That could certainly go back up. We're going to watch that, but still looking at really strong winds, a strong Category 3 storm, with winds at 125 miles per hour. The rainfall, we're going to see 2 to 4 inches, winds gusting up to 75 miles per hour, rough surf, really high seas. The good news is Bermuda is built for this. They're built, a lot of the buildings are built out of stone, and they are built for really strong hurricanes. So that's one piece of good news. Now, as we go throughout time here, by the weekend, this is going to enter the Canadian Maritimes. We're going to see historical pressure, low pressure. We're going to see damaging winds, torrential rainfall, and massive seas. So this will be a big story as we go throughout the later parts of Friday, Saturday, and also Sunday. Now, we are also tracking a few other systems. We have Tropical Storm Gaston. That's going to move out to sea, so that's good news. We'll check that off our list. Then a couple waves coming off Africa. It's this guy right here that is east of the Windward Islands, and we could see this impact the U.S. as early as the middle of next week. So it's classified as Invest 98L, most likely becoming a tropical depression in the next 2 days. And then if it becomes a tropical storm, which we expect, it will get its next name. So it is entering an area that's really conducive to development. We do expect it to develop Friday or Saturday. And look what happens as we go throughout time here. As opposed to Fiona that took that right-hand turn, you guys were looking at the potential for some impact anywhere from Texas to Tampa, so somewhere along the Gulf Coast.
That time of year?
Yeah, It is. Right, we're at peak season.
All right, thanks, Michelle.
Sure.
Well, more international news now. In Iran, internet is now restricted in the wake of anti-government protests.
NBC's Claudio Lavanga joined us from Rome with that and other world news. Claudio, good morning.
Good morning. Yes, street protests have been ongoing in Iran since last week after a 22-year-old woman died following her arrest by the so-called morality police for not wearing her headscarf correctly. Now, Iranian officials are saying that she died after she suffered a heart attack and then fell into a coma. But in a recent interview to the BBC, her father said that they are lying about her death. And let's move to New York, where leaders of South Korea and Japan agreed to boost efforts to mend diplomatic ties frayed by Japan's colonial past in the Korean peninsula. The two leaders met on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly for the first summit talks between their countries in 3 years. And the government in Barbados say it will refinance part of its debt to help save the ocean. Small country, which has the fourth largest marine space in the Caribbean, agreed to a $150 million debt conversion to finance projects to protect the waters surrounding the islands. Well, you can call it in some way a way to pay back the debt with nature, guys.
There you go. All right. Thank you, Claudio. Good to see that.
All right, coming up, the battle for Georgia. Stacey Abrams running for governor and looking to win over voters.
And we need folks to understand that for this race, it's not about what happens in Washington, it's what happens in Atlanta.
When we come back, an NBC News exclusive as Abrams campaigns against the incumbent for one of the most crucial midterm races. This is Morning News Now.
Welcome back. In one of the most closely watched governor's races in the country, Stacey Abrams is looking to sway Georgia voters in her campaign against incumbent Brian Kemp. NBC News correspondent Blaine Alexander spoke with her exclusively as she gears up for this election.
Well, this is perhaps the most closely watched governor's race in the country. And here in Georgia, it's more than 1 million new registered voters that could make all the difference.
How important is the state of Georgia?
Georgia is essential. Georgia is often a lead on what's going to happen across the country.
That became abundantly clear in 2020. It was Georgia that flipped blue for President Biden, Georgia that changed control of the U.S. Senate, and a key factor in it all, Stacey Abrams.
We found that there were 800,000 people of color who were not registered to vote in Georgia who were eligible. We knocked on their doors and we asked them, why aren't you registered? Why aren't you voting?
What did they tell you?
They said because they didn't trust government, because no one had ever asked, and because they felt overlooked.
Now, Abrams is looking to those same voters to help secure her own historic win.
I'm running to become governor of Georgia. If I'm successful, or when I am successful, I will be the first Black woman in American history to do so.
Abrams is in a rematch against Republican Governor Brian Kemp, who 4 years ago defeated her by less than 55,000 votes.
We have a great opportunity here in our state. But, you know, we are beating the bushes every single day, reminding people the differences and where we would be now, where we would have been if Stacey Abrams was your governor.
It's a tight race, though most polls show Kemp consistently ahead. But a lot has changed since they last met in 2018. Georgia now has 1.6 million newly registered voters, meaning more than 20% of the current electorate was not registered to vote in the last governor's race.
We want to harness those votes, but we don't take those votes for granted.
It means going to places typically considered Republican strongholds, like rural Georgia.
Are there votes to be won there?
Absolutely. If we can increase the vote share in those communities, we absolutely will see a change in the outcome of the election.
Find everything all right.
About 3 hours south of Atlanta, in Valdosta, Georgia, Glenn Stegall is the owner of Priceless Beauty Supply.
What is your #1 issue in this race?
In this race, I think you have to have a candidate who simply understands what we face on a day-to-day basis. We've got to be able to hire qualified candidates. That stems back to education.
He says he will vote, but convincing some family and friends to turn out, especially those who are not as enthusiastic as they were in 2020, is a struggle.
What do you say to that voter who then raises the question of, why should I go out and do this again?
That voting is not magic. Voting is medicine. It's less an enthusiasm gap than a trust gap. And we need folks to understand that for this race, it's not about what happens in Washington, it's what happens in Atlanta.
And early voting here in Georgia begins October 17th. Back to you.
All right, Blaine, thank you.
We're continuing to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month by taking a closer look at a growing trend. Latinos are reclaiming accent marks in first and last names.
A new Axios report traced back some of the reasons why the marks were abandoned in the first place by many Latinos while immigrating into the U.S. and how technology made it more complicated to use them.
Astrid Galvan joins us now for more on this. She is the editor of Axios Latino. Astrid, good to have you with us. Let's start at the beginning here. So why did some Latinos abandon the accent mark in their names? And what does this tell us about some of the obstacles that people were facing when they immigrated to the U.S.?
Hi, thank you for having me. Yeah, so this dates back to the early 1900s during the Mexican Revolution, when a lot of Mexican immigrants were making their way to the United States. A lot of them were illiterate both in Spanish and English. And so along the way, the documentation just didn't have the right accent marks. And then as time went on, a lot of Latinos who were raised in the U.S., second, third generation Latinos, there was a point in time where they were taught not to speak Spanish. They were punished in schools for speaking Spanish. And so it got even further lost.
And fascinating to me, Astrid, technology also played a role in the loss of these accent marks. How did that lead to more complications for trying to get these accents included?
Yeah, so when computers and keyboards were developed, they were developed with the English language in mind. And there were a lot of limitations to what coders could do at that time. And so accent marks and basically any non-English symbol were not included. And so even as far as recently, in government documents or in the computer typing out an email, it was really hard. It still is pretty hard to put those accent marks in there.
Big picture here. Why is this so important, and how does this help Latinos reconnect with their roots?
Yeah, I think we heard a lot from our readers who felt like, they wanted to show their pride in their heritage. For so long, Latinos in the U.S. have been told not to show their pride. They've been told to assimilate. And there's this kind of new way of thinking that says, hey, I am who I am. I should celebrate my culture. And also people should pronounce my name correctly, because these accent marks really drastically change the way some names and words are pronounced.
Is this something we're seeing with younger generations become a bigger thing?
Yeah, it's both. We heard from young readers, and we heard from middle-aged readers who are like C-suite professionals who just recently decided to add the accent marks in their name, for example, in their email signature.
All right, Astrid Galvan, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Coming up, controversy off the court. The owner of two teams in the NBA and WNBA now planning to sell.
We'll have more on his decision following claims of racism and sexism. More on that coming up.
Major developments in professional basketball. Robert Sarver, the embattled owner of the Phoenix Suns and the WNBA's Phoenix Mercury, says he's now planning to sell both teams.
Just a week ago, Sarver was suspended by the NBA for 1 year and fined $10 million after an investigation detailed nearly 2 decades of racist and sexist conduct in the workplace. For more on this, let's bring in Mike Volkanov. He's a national basketball business reporter for The Athletic. Mike, good morning to you. Thanks for being here. So Sarver released a statement yesterday saying in part, quote, "Whatever good I have done or could still do is outweighed by the things I have said in the past." Did this announcement come as a surprise to you?
I think the bigger surprise was the timing of it. It always seemed like it would be headed this way, not only because of the punishment that he received and the behavior that the NBA's own investigation found, but the reaction from stars like LeBron James and Chris Paul and the head of the NBPA. I think the biggest surprise here is that it only took 8 days after the NBA's investigation came out for Sarver to make this decision. I thought, honestly, it might take at least a few more weeks, but it always seemed like it would be headed here at some point.
You mentioned some of the reaction from LeBron James, Chris Paul. It's criticism about the league's decision to suspend Sarver for 1 year. Do we know why the punishment wasn't harsher? And I'm thinking back to Clippers owner Donald Sterling nearly 10 years ago. It's a story that we covered for weeks. I mean, he was banned for life over a controversy that was fairly similar.
Yeah, and that's the biggest juxtaposition, obviously. It was something Commissioner Adam Silver addressed at his press conference as well. You know, he said that there was some mitigating information, that he had privileged information that came through the investigation that wasn't in the report, that he said helped him make the decision, that only led to a 1-year suspension for Robert Sarver as opposed to a full lifetime ban for Donald Sterling in 2014. Obviously, the two scenarios seem so much similar That one had a recording of Donald Sterling using racist language. This one had a report of Robert Sarver using racist language, being, demeaning women, having a workplace that discriminated against women, a host of what the report itself called bullying behavior. I think one of the things that probably played into it was there was just so much more attention as well paid to Donald Sterling. As you said, you guys covered it for weeks. Yeah. The attention to the Robert Sarver incident was big within the NBA and basketball circles, but I think outside of the league and people interested in the league, it just wasn't as much. And obviously, I don't know if the league would ever say that, but these things do seem to always play a role.
Such different outcomes. And of course, professional sports franchises are very lucrative. So how much do you think Sarver could actually get potentially selling these teams?
Well, that's the big question now. They're valued publicly through several, companies that evaluate the value of sports franchises around $2 billion. But my reporting, I think an early look at the market says they could even get above $3 billion. That would be a record for an NBA team. And that would net Robert Sarver, personally, he's got somewhere between a 30 and a 40% stake in the franchise. It could net him $1 billion as a result of everything.
All right, Mike, thank you.
All right, business news now. Walmart is gearing up for, yes, holiday shopping season.
CNBC's Silvana Henao joins us with that and a whole lot more. Good morning, Silvana.
Hey guys, good morning. Well, Walmart is rolling more plans for the holiday shopping season. It's extending the window on returns from October 1st through January 31st. That's a month earlier than in past years. It's also launching curbside returns in early October, and Walmart Plus members in some markets will be able to even have returns picked up from their doorstep. Walmart announced yesterday it's hiring 40,000 part-time and full-time workers for the holidays. That's actually well below the 150,000 hired last year. Airfares could become even more expensive. The head of the International Air Transport Association, a body that represents many of the world's top airlines, tells CNBC that's due to the lack of refining capacity for jet fuel and the risk of an escalation in the war in Ukraine, which could further tighten global fuel supplies. He also says while consumers are paying higher prices for tickets, airlines aren't necessarily making a profit. They're passing on costs that they can't absorb or avoid. And General Motors is closing reservations for the electric GMC Hummer pickup and SUV after orders topped 90,000. GM has been slowly ramping up production of the Hummer this year. Closing reservations is a way for GM to try to fill the current list of reserved vehicles, which extends out to at least 2024. Now, the starting price on the Hummer pickup and SUV ranges from $85,000 to $111,000, guys.
All right, for that price, I hope it has a bed and a kitchen.
Right? Maybe a living room, too, would be
exactly.
nice.
Right.
Yeah, for that price, indeed. All right, Silvana, thank you.
Coming up. Welcome back. If you are a fan of the late beloved Golden Girl Betty White, and who isn't? Well, you now have a chance to bid on her stuff. More than 1,500 items from White's storied life and career will be up for auction during a 3-day event in Beverly Hills beginning tomorrow. Organizers expect bids to come from all over the world for this exclusive collection, which includes various awards, signed movie scripts, even her wedding ring. I don't want her ring, Stephen, but pretty much anything else on this list is going to be on my holiday wish list this year.
I totally believe it. It's going to be pretty expensive as well. I've never met anyone who doesn't love Betty White.
Exactly. We end this hour with the story of a military mom who's used to wearing camouflage, but recently tried on a different uniform. NBC News Now anchor Tom Yamas explains why.
He may only be 13 years old, but Julian Labadog knows a lot about service and sacrifice.
Serving in the military is hard, but it's also hard on the families.
His mom, Deli Labanog, a U.S. Army reservist. She spent the last 11 months serving our country overseas, a deployment that worried Julian.
Scared that I could lose her because she was going to be in Kuwait, and Kuwait isn't that far from Afghanistan.
What kept the family connected? Daily FaceTimes with Dad Fabian and younger sister Eliza.
It was refreshing to be able to see her face, even in a very blurry quality. It took me from being alone over there to feeling like we were connected, and it allowed us to just, not miss anything with each other.
But after months overseas, an opportunity came up to surprise Julian at his school. Deli trading in her Army combat uniform for another kind of camouflage.
Principal was like, I typically walk around in the mascot uniform and surprise the kids during lunch or assemblies. wouldn't it be great if your wife did the same for Julian?
Deli suiting up in the school's Rocky the Roadrunner costume, joining Julian for a math review.
So currently we are reviewing our homework answers. So I saw him and I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. And he started explaining what they were doing. And I was just like, oh my God, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Wow, you're so smart. Huh? I went into tears because I hadn't seen my mom for a year, and they were happy tears, not sad tears. I was actually surprised that she got to wear the mascot costume.
And Julian, not the only one happy to see mom. Daughter Eliza also got a surprise.
1, 2, 3. Look at the door, boys and girls. Who knows this person?
I was surprised. I was happy that Mom came back.
And for both Eliza and Julian, mom coming home, but also coming home with some good news.
I'm home for quite some time. I won't be going anywhere in the near future. Relieved that mom's back and safe here in the States.
We should just do an entire special of soldier surprises, like 2 hours straight.
I would watch that. Love that.
Can't get enough of that. Our thanks to Tom Yamas for bringing us that story. That does it for this hour of Morning News Now.
But your news continues right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.